Women of Reddit, what was your worst run-in with a creep? So, last year I got a flat tire on a semi-busy road right when a snowstorm started. Since I had AAA, I figured I would use one of my roadside assistants to have them replace the tire with a spare that I had. And I wouldn't have to go outside since I forgot gloves. While I was waiting, a mid-40s early 50s man came up to my window and asked if I needed help. Thinking that he was just a good Samaritan at the time, I thanked him but told him, no, I was just waiting for AAA. Now, if he left here, I would have a nice story about a guy willing to help me with a car problem. Instead, he gets downright pushy. He lives nearby. I can just take my car there and change it's in his garage. Why don't I just stay in his house until AAA comes? I kept telling him no until he starts yelling. And I rolled up the window and he starts pounding on it. Eventually he left when the AAA guy came. But I still took a very long and circuitous route home. I was 8 years old and waiting for the bus in the morning to go to my mom's work. A guy sat next to me at the bus stop and his bus pass was the wrong color. Expired. He told me he loved me and as scary as it is, I said thank you, and the bus finally came. I got on first and the bus driver lady immediately shut the door behind me. She said the man knelt down to try and look up my shorts and that he wouldn't be taking the bus with us. I told my mom and after work we went and bought me my first pepper spray as a ducking 8-year-old. 14 years old and alone on the subway. Man sits in a seat across from me, spreads his legs and starts masturbating through his pants while staring me straight in the eyes. I was getting ready to jump up and run out at the next stop. An older gentleman suddenly appeared, stood directly in front of me like a shield and stared the guy down. At the next stop he pointed to the door and made him get off. I hope I said thank you but I was in shock. So thank you dear man who protected me and made me feel safe. When I delivered pizzas and I was 18 this guy asked me if I wanted to step in while he grabbed his money. It was cold and rainy so I took him up on the offer. He ended up trying to keep me there till his mom got home because he didn't have enough for the pizza. He tried to force me into a pyramid scheme and kept making uncomfortable comments about me. I had left my phone in my car so I couldn't text my manager to call me to give me an out because no matter how hard I tried to leave this guy would find some way to block my path. I took off when he went to the bathroom and told my manager about what happened. Females weren't allowed to deliver to him anymore. We eventually found out he was a convicted sex offender too. Normally I find an out and I always have an escape plan. But I put myself in a position where I couldn't give myself an escape. I went on to manage deliver pizzas for several years. But after that day I implemented a new rule which was, never enter anyone's home unless I knew who it was. I'd stand in the pouring rain any day over entering a stranger's home. I come from a safe low crime area, but my gut instinct that night was that I was in danger. A few years ago I lived in a tiny condo right next to a few trails in San Diego. I was on a pretty strict running and hiking routine. One night it got dark faster than expected. A man who appeared to be about 6'3" and 200 pounds approached me as I was nearing the end of my hike. He told me, with a smirk on his face, to be careful as there are many things that could hurt me when the sun goes down. The next day as I'm exiting my back gate he's standing there as if he's waiting for me. He introduced himself and admitted he's been watching me for a while. I decided to pretend like I was grabbing something from my car and went back into my house. For the next few days I see this guy circling my condo, looking in if the curtains are open. He was always walking around day and night. I checked the Megan's Law website and surprise, there he was. Multiple charges including abuse by force or fear and illegal material. I decided to contact his parole officer and he immediately returned my call, stated he could tell I fit his MO and to use extreme caution. He said he would do what he could to get him out of the neighborhood. After that call I thankfully never saw him again. I was 19. Worked at a main library in my city, with several floors and an elevator. I was taking a book track. The library guard got on. As soon as the door closed he cornered me and kissed me. He was at least 40 and much bigger than me. I never got on an elevator alone with him again, nor with anyone else that I didn't know. There was a creepy hunched old man who used to come into a pub I worked at. He used to say and do slightly weird things, and then one day he called one of the glass collectors fat. She was 16 at the time, and to apologize he went to fist bump her, then grabbed her hand and put her fingers in his mouth. Made eye contact with a guy across the street, smiled at him to be polite. He followed me home without me realizing it and spent the next few days stalking me, following me when I left the house, leaving notes on my front door, etc. Had to get the cops involved. A guy who stays regularly at the hotel I work in. All the female staff know to avoid getting caught alone with him. He has a habit of asking us if we know of any adult fun nearby. If you just act like you don't know what he's talking about, he'll say he wants to go to brothels and have a good time without his wife. He'll then progress to offering you various amounts of money for the night and asking you what you like in bed and what you'd be willing to do. He developed such an obsession with one of our staff before she left that security would walk round with her when he stayed because he'd followed her out to her car at one point making suggestive comments. Got stuck alone with him once as I was behind the counter and he stood blocking the only way out from behind it. He started the usual chat and I told him I wasn't interested. He then moved on to asking me what time I finished, if I lived nearby, if I walked home alone. My male co-worker turned up then, but he creeped on me from a distance the rest of the day and watched me leave. I have no doubt he will assault someone one day. Hotel won't ban him because he regularly spends money. Edit. I woke up to so many replies on here. Quite a lot of people are telling me to share the name of the hotel so they can leave bad reviews. The thing is that it's probably already not in the best financial place due to the pandemic, and tanking it that way could result in a lot of people losing their jobs. It's badly managed, but I do have co-workers I don't want to put in that position. I hadn't thought of the police as being useful in that kind of situation, but it's a good idea. Even the mention of reporting to them may force the managers to act. My department's manager, who had a tendency to tell us to suck it up, was replaced just before the pandemic. The new manager is female, so I'm hoping she'll be more sensitive to the situation and push upper management to act next time. Weird Larry lived in my dorm. He unsuccessfully hit on all the girls, which is why he was Weird Larry. It totally ruined his self-esteem. One night, Larry just showed up and invited himself into my room. I was not fully clothed. He took this as an invitation and climbed up into my bunk bed. I asked him to get down, and he asked me to come up there with him so we could have sex. When I refused, he took some quarters out of his pocket, put them on my nightstand and said, "What if I paid you? You could do your laundry." I told him that wasn't enough change to do a full load of laundry, and he started crying and getting snot all over my pillow. I had to go wake up the road person in charge of the dorm and have him escorted out. Then he wouldn't stop sending me messages. They became more desperate until they became threats at rape. I saved the messages and used them to file a restraining order. A few other girls wanted in on it, so Weird Larry was evicted from his own dormitory and had to drop out of school. TLDR, came into my dorm room uninvited, then gave me some quarters and told me he was paying me for sex. Then he cried when I said no, wound up needing a restraining order. A guy saw me in the metro and thought I was cute, which meant he had to follow me on my 5 kilometers walk home to my flat in the middle of the night. He introduced himself to me as I was about to put in the key to my door. I smiled at a guy I passed in the park, as I do everyone I pass. He immediately turned around and followed me, but not before he began masturbating with his entire D and balls out of his shorts. The most memorable was when I was sitting in my parents' front garden, on the swing, reading. The way everything is laid out with the trees and whatnot, you can barely see the swing deck BBQ area from any perspective that's not from the front door. Very private spot. Anyway, I was just sitting there reading when I hear someone walking up. Assume it's a family member because how would it not be? Someone plops down on the swing next to me, throws an arm around me, and it's just some ducking guy. Says some stuff, tries to move closer and proceeds to attempt to keep me from leaving when I get up. Egged of there. Practically sprint back to the house and tell my dad what just happened and that there's some asshole in our garden being completely gross at me. He just laughs and says, "Oh, that's just new across the street neighbor. Be nice." The duck? Over the next couple years, Ted would go on to make me and my older, only occasionally visiting, sisters super uncomfortable any chance he got. Long stories, and his poor, but large and angry, dog was always loose in the neighborhood and murdering other people's pets. That methodica still makes my blood boil. When I was 16 I went to Walmart with some of my siblings. I broke off to go look in the shoe section for some sandals, and as I turned a corner I almost ran into this guy, very nondescript, wearing the jumper most guys who worked at the plants near there wore. For some reason I immediately got a really bad feeling, panicked, and turned around and went to the nearest other section. Took a few minutes to calm down enough to realize that it was the baby section and that I was staring at an infant bouncer for which I had no use. I laughed at myself, put it down to how anxious and socially awkward I was, and then turned around to go back to the shoe section. I then realized that guy was now in the baby section and that bad feeling came back. What were the odds he actually needed something there? I fled to the women's clothing section, thinking that there was no reason he would appear there. I was shaking, pretending to look at things and telling myself that I was being ridiculous, when he came up behind me and grabbed my behind so hard his fingers got places I wish they hadn't and whispered something in my ear. He immediately walked away, before I could do anything. I listen to those bad feelings now. Frankly, I consider myself extremely lucky. I also really wish I could remember what he said, but everything was kind of roaring and went blurry. I was so panicked. I was walking my dog and made the mistake of not rushing home okay once it got dark. A man in a baseball cap and oversized jacket blocked my path to comment how pretty my dog was and how I must take good care of him. I smiled tightly and thanked him, told him to have a good day and nodded and went to go around him. So he naturally grabbed my arm and said, "Yeah, I bet you take real good care of anything you have. You married?" I lied and said yes. He let me go but followed me home. I wound up calling my boyfriend to come pick me up. When I was 13, a 50-something-year-old man said in front of my mother that if I ever misbehaved he would give me a spanking. Kinda out of the blue. Then when her attention was averted he kinda snuck a hug for a few seconds too long. Nothing super crazy but hella awkward. Used to work with this old man that would touch me all the time on my arm or my back. It's hard for me to make a scene, although I wish that I had been direct with him. My solution was to shuffle away from him anytime he got close to me. It did seem to fix it, but he was kind of a D afterwards. Also same job. I was kissed on the neck by another co-worker very suddenly. This guy was not from the US, so I chalked it up to cultural differences. But I did not view him the same way afterwards. I was 21 in a strange city and got separated from my friend at a bar. I was drunk and wanted to go back to the hotel, so as I'm leaving, this guy who had been sitting near me all night followed and got in my cab with me and closed the door. Again, I was very drunk, so had to think quickly and stay as calm as possible. He tried to talk to me and I just nodded and made small talk. I didn't know if rejection would turn him violent, so I played along the best I could. After telling the driver where to take me, the whole time this guy is moving closer and touching me. So as soon as the car stopped I got out, ran into the hotel lobby where I knew this man would be following me, and screamed to the hotel security and desk employees, "I do not know this man. He is following me," and they took it from there. In 5th grade, after ballet practice, I was only wearing shorts and a jacket over my dance clothes, leotard and tights, and standing in a Chipotle line. Some old dude was behind me and asking me about my phone. According to my mother, he was looking at my body, scanning it up and down. Even before I found that out, he gave me the creeps. When we left, he rushed to pick up his order and ran out the door after us and followed us home. He stopped following at the last turn. I had trouble sleeping. Have a creepy old neighbor 70+ who calls me pet names and looks through my windows as well as pinning letters to my door. My friend and I were 16 and wandering around at a Sephora in the mall, just swatching eyeshadow and highlighter on our wrists. He was the only guy in the store, and I only vaguely noticed him in the same aisle as us just before we paid. It didn't ring any alarm bells for me whatsoever, because why should it? We picked up our highlighter and went to pay. The girl at the register rung up our items. leaned over and said quietly, "That guy followed you two into the store and has been watching you in each aisle. I'm going to give you your bags. And go ask him if he needs any help. You two need to get as far away as possible. If you see him follow you outside of this store, go talk to security." She handed us our bags, gestured at the door, and walked up to him as we ran out. I hope she gets all the good things in this life. Lived in a super cheap, super itty apartment when I was in college. It was a decent city, but the apartment was located in the only bad neighborhood. I was willing to deal with it for $300 per month rent because of the price. People constantly moved in and then bailed after a month or two. One of these people was an older, 50s 60s, veteran. He seemed polite at first, but after he had been there a few days I'd catch him weirdly leaning to watch me from behind a wall when I'd be outside and my boyfriend wasn't around. He'd wait for me to be outside and then run up to start a conversation. The conversations were usually harmless at first, then would get creepy, like asking what my favorite sex position is and other inappropriate questions. About 2 months in, I was leaving my house at like 10 PM and I saw him stumbling around the parking lot covered in blood. I quickly left and never saw him again. However, a few days later my landlord knocked on my door and was pale in the face. He asked me if I had seen anything unusual with the guy. I explained that I had, and asked why. He said that if I ever see him on the property again, I need to call the cops first and then call him. It took some prying to find out why, and he told me that he just went in to clean out his apartment and all that the guy had in his house was a dirty mattress, a broken toaster, and a full-on sex dungeon. I don't know what all that entailed, but he mentioned the place was full of bondage and restraint type things. It still makes my skin crawl to think about it. Was walking down the sidewalk and a guy whistled at me from his car. I ignored him and kept walking. He revved his engine loudly and ran his car up on the sidewalk, missing me by a couple of feet. I was 12. I talked to him for 2 minutes at a welcome icebreaker game when university first started. A few months later, I decided to not go to university anymore and to move in with my parents. I had not seen him since the game. He contacted not me but the priest of our village. He told him I had a special aura and he needed me around. He drove 2 hours to say that to my priest. Thank God the priest did not like that and called me and offered to call the cops. It still haunts me how much he must have found of me online research to know where I live and that I was religious. I definitely did not tell him that. Really weird. Probably the guy at a bar who pinned me against a wall and told me not going home with him wasn't an option. On the plus side, I got to sprint into a cab, slam the door, and exclaim "just drive." So that was cool. I was walking to the train station at 9 PM in a very isolated area. No one was around. 2 men were following me as I'm sure they knew I was going to the train station, and in order to get there, I had to go through a dark alley. They were 2 huge men and I was shorter and also a minor, which was obvious cause I had a backpack. They started trying to corner me and then they asked questions about where I live and if I live in the area, and then a big family came and the men left. There was a guy in my hometown that would wait outside the high school with the door to his Corvette open, hoping a girl would get in. I lived in the middle of nowhere. To get to my house I had to walk over a mile on a 1-lane dirt road, winding through a forest. One day as the school bus was approaching my laneway to drop me off, the Corvette guy was waiting in my laneway with his door open. The bus driver wouldn't let me off the bus. He continued to the next drop and told me to go to that house and call my parents to pick me up. This was in the days before cell phones existed. I've met many creeps, but the one that immediately came to mind is the dude that put his hand down the front of my pants at a concert. He tried to play it off like it was an accident. Things get pretty crowded in the pit, so it's not like there's any personal space, but hand down my pants, there's no way that's an accident. He was with who I presume was his girlfriend, and when I turned around to be like WTF, she glared at me like I was trying to hit on him. So yeah, probably the guy that sexually assaulted me in front of his girlfriend. Typical guy wouldn't take no as the answer. He was part of the church group I was with at the time. Asked me out. I said no. Asked me out again. Again no. Then he started showing up on my college campus just randomly. He didn't go there. so I informed campus police. Then he began showing up at the places my college group hung out at. Some of my bigger guy friends told him to get lost. Then he started showing up where I worked. So some of my friends started hanging out with me at work. He then began showing up randomly at my house. So I called the police and took out a restraining order against him. Luckily it worked. That said, I am a much different person now than I was in college. Now it would have stopped at the second no and gone not one bit further. A guy at my university followed me around for about 15 years. I have a unique surname. There used to be a way for students to use Pine to find out who else was logged in and where on campus. He would use that command and show up in the computer lab and sit next to me. He looked me up in the phone book and showed up at my parents' house. After a restraining order. You would think it was done right? Wrong. I was speaking at an international conference in another country. Guess who was sitting in the front row? This was a conference for a very niche scientific field that he was definitely not part of. A few years later, I was at an alumni event with my husband. My husband left the table to go to the washroom. Guess who sat down the second he left? Police were called. It's been a few years since the last incident. Still paranoid. This was many years ago, when I was 14 and attending my first semester of Catholic high school in New York. Let me tell ya, a young teenage girl in a Catholic school uniform brings the creeps out. I was walking home from the train station and a guy, probably in his 20s, yells from across the street to ask me the time. No problem. He's probably trying to catch a train. So I check my watch to tell him. Suddenly he's crossing the street towards me and is now walking in my direction. I get a little nervous and start walking faster, but before I know it, he's next to me, asking me if the name of my lipstick shade is cocksucking red, telling me how he'd love to wrap his hand in my hair and shove my lips onto his cock. On and on. I whack him with my book bag and sprint like FloJo herself to my apartment. My older brother went out with his friends to try to find the guy. He never told me if they did, but that guy never bothered me again. So yeah. I'm 43 now and I still remember it like yesterday, and I still hardly ever wear lipstick. 15-year-old me went shopping and felt a weird touch when I was browsing books. Didn't think anything of it. Then again another touch. Turned around to see a grown-ass man trying to touch me up in public in the middle of the day in a bookshop. I was so scared. I just stood there staring at him. Me. Now. Have done it differently. Also a guy approached me at the school gates. Maybe 14, and followed me down the roads, but finally left when I wouldn't get into his car. City living can be scary at times. I unfortunately have a few stories, but this is one that tops the list. I'm a bartender and one night I was serving 3 men who work at an Italian restaurant nearby. I was offered a job, which I politely declined. They were my last patrons. I closed out their tab, finished my side work and had a busboy walk me to my car. As the busboy left in his own car, this black Porsche SUV blocks me in my spot. The window is rolled down and I realize it's the owner of the Italian restaurant. He asks if I want to go home with him. I decline. He asks if the busboy was my boyfriend and I lied and said yes. He scoffed and sped off. I hurry and leave to head home. As I pull into my parking spot at my house, I see the same SUV drive by. I woke up my neighbor who was a military guy, and he said he'd keep an eye out. That night I found the guy's name online, his Facebook profile, his business profile, his wife's profile and his phone number. I took screenshots and sent them all to him telling him not to harass me or I'll retaliate. I never heard from him again. Lesson learned, always pay attention to your surroundings while driving home. I was walking with my children on a secluded river walk. I noticed that we were being followed at a distance. I figure this individual may just be enjoy the same path I was. We stepped off the trail onto a scenic deck off the path that overlooked the river. I was showing the girls the ducks and different types of trees. We hung out there for about 20 minutes. However, I noticed the person behind us on the path did not reach us in that time. At that moment, I heard a stick snap off in the woods close to us. I then saw this man hiding behind large shrubs. Thinking he was unable to be seen, this man had been watching my children and I for the entire time we had been stopped. He was getting closer. Aware that I could see him, it became apparent to me that we were in danger. I told the older child to grab the stroller and run to closest public area, to yell for help, to call 911. I then confronted the man as he came barreling out of the woods. He realized he had been spotted. When I was 12 and just starting to develop, a guy, maybe in his late 20s, told me titties are coming along nicely. I was so freaked out. Had quite a few bad experiences, but one was when I was walking on the road with a friend. Two guys came on bikes, slapped my ass very hard, it really hurt, and fled the scene. I was only 15. I was so shocked and screamed loudly and everyone stared at me. It was so embarrassing. I cried for days. Edit. To the creep that sent me a personal message saying I couldn't handle the neutron style. Yes, I couldn't. I don't often share my experiences as I think people may not believe or care. But some kind of people of Reddit genuinely seem to care. Stop sending me horrible PMS. This happened back in the summer of 2017. I was walking to work and was about 1 stroke to a mile away, and it was around 8:45 am. This guy in a car slowed down next to me and asked where I was going and if I needed a ride. I politely said no and just kept walking. The dude ducking followed me all the way, driving slow, and kept asking over and over if he could give me a ride. I said no several more times, then just ignored him. Luckily the way to my work was a heavy traffic area with other people walking around. As teenagers, we, 3 females, were walking to the local park when a middle-aged man started following us. We made it to the park and he came in and actually started swinging, glancing our way occasionally. After a few minutes we decided we felt too weird and left. He got up and started following us again, so we ran, found a police officer and told him and gave him a description of the man. It's impossible to tell if he just was maybe a mentally challenged man who didn't know how to talk to people, or if he actually was a pedo. But we didn't want to find out. It was a tiny town, half-mile long town center, and we weren't aware of any mentally challenged guys that hung around the area despite being pretty well aware of all the known faces in our town. When I was 17, a man who looked to be about in his 30s followed me around a Macy's when I was shopping with my aunt. I did notice him at first because he made eye contact with me a couple of times but thought nothing of it. After about 30 minutes he was still lurking around. But, again, I just thought it was in my head. My aunt went to check out and I was browsing around when suddenly the man appeared out of nowhere, handed me a note, and walked away. He wrote that he couldn't stop looking me and all this other pathetic garbage. At the end he left his phone number and said he hoped I called him. I remember being so creeped out that this man stalked me and then wanted someone so young to contact him. I did not contact him. I never want to feel like prey again.